Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Let's just jump right into it. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating tension that sits at the absolute core of American identity. We're looking at the intricate and, honestly, sometimes totally contradictory relationship between a leader's personal faith and the highest office in the land. From the Founding Fathers all the way to the modern era, a president's religion has been a source of fierce debate, political strategy, and deep personal conviction. So let's dive into this. We have a great roadmap for today. We'll explore the current presidential religion paradox, look at the dominant Protestant denominations, and check out the skeptics with unorthodox beliefs. After that, we'll see who broke the Protestant mold, how the Cold War reshaped modern faith, and wrap up by looking at the future of faith. All right, starting with Section 1, the presidential religion paradox. Let's talk about the massive elephant in the room. Get this. According to a 2021 Gallup poll, only 47% of Americans today belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque. 47%. That is a dramatic, steep drop from 70% back in 1999. Now, why are so many Americans declining to affiliate? Well, it's driven largely by shifting generational attitudes and a much broader cultural move away from formal, traditional institutions. People are just stepping back. But here is the wild part. You look at our political landscape, and candidates are constantly hyping up how religious they are, always making sure the media gets that perfect photo op of them walking into church on Sunday. Why the performance if membership is plummeting? It all comes down to a striking contradiction. Article 6, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution explicitly states that no one can be forced to take a religious test to hold government office. None whatsoever. But the modern political reality, it's very different. Pew Research shows that 1 in 5 American adults say it is very important for a president to have strong religious beliefs. So the crucial takeaway here is that while the law strictly forbids a religious test, voters are absolutely enforcing one at the ballot box. Moving into Section 2, dominant Protestant denominations. For a really long time, having the quote-unquote right religion was essentially a prerequisite for the Oval Office. Historically speaking, 2 distinct denominations have completely dominated the American presidency, the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians. This effectively saves us from reading a giant laundry list of presidents, because historically the vast majority fall neatly right into these 2 camps. You have Episcopalians like George Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and George H.W. Bush. On the flip side, you have Presbyterians like Andrew Jackson, Benjamin Harrison, and Woodrow Wilson, who, fun fact, was actually the president of Princeton University back when it was deeply tied to the Presbyterian Church. Christianity has always been the biggest religion in the U.S., but these 2 specific denominations were the ultimate gold standard for its leaders. Some guys, though, took that traditional affiliation to a whole other level. Take Presbyterian Grover Cleveland. His dad was actually a Presbyterian minister, and as a young man, Cleveland would attend multiple church services every single Sunday, on top of going to Sunday school. I mean, that is a serious level of dedication, but it perfectly highlights just how deeply ingrained these establishment Protestant roots were in early American leadership. But, not everyone fit perfectly into that neat little Protestant box. Let's move to Section 3 and explore the skeptics and the presidents who held some highly unorthodox beliefs for their time. To really understand these skeptics, we need to quickly define deism and Unitarianism. These were belief systems that often flat-out rejected strict Calvinist dogma, like predestination. They also frequently rejected the literal miracles of the Bible and even the divinity of Jesus Christ. And we aren't talking about fringe outsiders here, we're talking about heavy hitters, founding fathers. John Adams was Unitarian, and James Madison held views that strongly leaned toward deism. And that brings us to Thomas Jefferson. His religious views were constantly evolving, and honestly, they drove his political rivals completely crazy. Jefferson literally took a razor to the New Testament. He physically cut out all the miracles and supernatural elements, keeping only the moral teachings of Jesus. Today, we famously call this the Jefferson Bible. Because of his lifelong crusade to separate church and state, during the incredibly nasty election of 1800, John Adams' supporters actually accused Jefferson of being an atheist, though historians today generally consider him to be a Christian deist. Then we have Abraham Lincoln. There is actually zero concrete evidence that Lincoln ever officially had any religion or formally affiliated with a church. But a lack of affiliation definitely didn't mean a lack of deep spiritual thought. During one of the absolute darkest moments of the Civil War, he mused profoundly on faith, saying, "The will of God prevails, God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. It just perfectly captures a man who is deeply contemplative about a higher power without subscribing to organized dogma. William Howard Taft was remarkably open about his unorthodox theology. He just came right out and declared, "I am a Unitarian. I believe in God. I do not believe in the divinity of Christ." Taft was so transparent about his views that he actually turned down an offer to be the president of Yale University. Why? Because at the time, Yale was affiliated with the Congregationalist Church, which required a belief in Christ's divinity. He literally chose his personal truth over a prestigious position. Which brings us to Section 4, Breaking the Protestant Mold. Because for a long time, if your personal truth wasn't Protestant, the path to the presidency was incredibly rocky. Let's look at those who fought that uphill battle. The public acceptance of Catholic candidates has been a very, very slow evolution. Back in 1928, being Catholic was considered a massive political liability, and widespread anti-Catholic sentiment was a huge reason Al Smith lost his presidential bid. Fast forward to 1960, and John F. Kennedy still faced such intense suspicion that he had to publicly defend his faith. It took another 60 years before Joe Biden was elected in 2020, becoming only the second Catholic president in American history. To survive that 1960 election, JFK had to draw a really hard line in the sand. He famously declared, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate, who happens also to be a Catholic." He had to explicitly assure voters that he did not speak for his church, and more importantly, that his church did not speak for him on public matters. Catholics weren't the only minority faith to reach the White House, though. We've also had exactly 2 Quaker presidents. Herbert Hoover, who actually ran against Al Smith in 1928, honorably refused to attack Smith's Catholicism, instead stepping up to defend religious freedom. The second was Richard Nixon. Nixon grew up so deeply ingrained in his evangelical Quaker meeting house that he actually played piano for Sunday school services and sang in the choir. Now let's jump to Section 5. Because the mid-20th century completely changed the game. Personal faith was no longer just a background detail, it became an explicit tool of government policy. Enter Dwight Eisenhower. Interestingly enough, Eisenhower had no formal church affiliation until he became president. But just 12 days after his inauguration, on February 1st, 1953, he was baptized as a Presbyterian. He is the first and only president to be baptized while actively holding the office. And this wasn't just a personal milestone, it actually reflected a massive geopolitical shift. You see, presidents like Truman and Eisenhower were framing the Cold War not just as a political struggle, but as a moral battle. It was framed as the United States and its allies, who followed God, against the perceived threat of an atheist Soviet Union. Because of this, Eisenhower enthusiastically embraced connecting the government with theism. This is exactly the era when the phrase "under God" was permanently added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and "In God We Trust" became the official motto of the United States. By the 1970s, wearing your faith on your sleeve had become a massive political advantage. Jimmy Carter, a lifelong Baptist and dedicated Sunday school teacher, proudly campaigned on his born-again Christian beliefs. He ushered in the modern era of the powerful evangelical voting bloc, millions of whom turned out just for him. It set a whole new standard for modern presidents, paving the way for figures like Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush to openly connect their Christianity to their governance. Which brings us to our final section, the future of faith. Let's summarize the historical data and see exactly where the presidency stands today in a rapidly changing country. When we look at all the numbers, Protestantism has held an overwhelming monopoly over the Oval Office. Out of all our presidents, only 4 men fall outside that Protestant slice: John F. Kennedy and Joe Biden, who are Catholic, and Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson, who were officially unaffiliated with any specific religion. And that leads to a rather stark reality when you consider the incredible diversity of the American population today. 0 presidents have ever been Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or Jewish. And despite those early accusations thrown at guys like Jefferson and Taft, no president has ever openly admitted to being an atheist. Which brings us right back to where we started. If only 47% of Americans today belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque, the modern electorate is vastly less affiliated with organized religion than ever before in our history. Yet the Oval Office has remained almost completely unchanged in its religious makeup. So I leave you with this question. Given this massive cultural shift away from formal congregations, when will the United States elect its first non-Christian or openly atheist president? It's a fascinating thought to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.